Hey, good morning, friends. I wanted to try this today and see how it worked, and hopefully this will give us an opportunity to make this appear a little bit more like a traditional class where you get the chance to hear me explain things rather than to have to rely solely upon the reading. So please give me some feedback and let me know how this works, if you're able to hear it okay, if the visual comes through, and so on. So what we're doing this week is starting into chapter 1 of my book, The Moral World. And the first thing that I introduce in that text is the concept of divine command theory. Divine command theory is probably the oldest and one of the more controversial views of ethics. Divine command theory says that what is morally right is simply what God or the gods declare to be right. If God says that it's right, then it is, and it's our duty to obey it. If God or the gods say that it's wrong, then it's our duty, to reject it. And so God is the principal author of this. That view is very popular, very prominent in the early stages of the world. But as time goes on, we discover certain flaws, certain problems. In the text, I gave you a section from Plato's Euthyphro, and hopefully you've had a chance to read that. But Plato's Euthyphro, an interesting enough piece in its own right, but it also has a very strong condemnation of this divine command theory. The divine command theory, its problem is that if you accept it, then you have to either accept that God is irrelevant, or you have to accept that morality is really non-existent. Because if you say that God declares what is right, then that means that there is no morally right or wrong. It's simply the will of God, whatever God decides, and that means that morality could be a fleeting, changing thing. God could say this is right at this moment, and then this is right at another moment, and so on. So there really is no morality that is absolute or true. Instead, it would simply be the will of God, which could be altering and changing. On the other hand, if you were to argue, but maybe the reason that God says that this is morally right is because it is, then all God is doing is making a pronouncement based upon the facts of morality. And so morality itself would be the principal feature. Morality would be real, whereas God would be irrelevant, because the morality, the right or the wrong, would be there with or without him. So, if you accept divine command theory, then that implies that either God is irrelevant or there is no morality. And that's why most people have, in the last 2,000 years or so anyway, 2,300 years since Plato, have rejected it. One notable exception, which you'll see a little bit later on in the course, is the Islamic tradition. They have and continue to embrace the idea of divine command. But virtually everyone else has rejected it in favor of some other view or some other theory. But one of the things that I try to point out here in chapter 1 is that the whole question of divine command theory really misses the mark. Because when we're talking about morality, we're talking about this world. We're talking about the relationship that one human being has to another human being. We're talking about material circumstances. Morality does not transcend beyond this world, but rather if we start talking about issues or questions of God, then we transcend beyond this world to a higher telos. And so there is something greater, there is something more, something higher than morality. I point out in the first chapter there that this is something that Kierkegaard comes to in his work Fear and Trembling. In that particular text, he tells us, that we sometimes imagine that morality is the highest order, but it isn't. We can transcend beyond it. We can transcend to something higher, which is faith. And so if you're dealing with religious issues, you're dealing with something that is of God, that is of something beyond the material, beyond this world. And that means that what you're looking at is transcending beyond the moral realm. I've given you two examples within this text. The first one I turn to is a very famous story in the Bible, Genesis 22, what's known as the Akedah, or the ritual binding of Isaac. And the other is something that may be less familiar to you, but part of my program here is to introduce a lot of cultural diversity into the course. And so I've introduced the idea of the story of Arjuna and Krishna from the Bhagavad Gita. In both of these instances, we have people being asked to do something by God which seems contrary to morality. And some people will try to say, oh, well, because God has said to do it, that makes it morally right. But of course it doesn't. The point that Kierkegaard tries to make, the point that we see in both of these stories as you read through them, is that it doesn't make it morally right because God has said so. From the standpoint of morality, the action of Abraham, of taking Isaac to the mountaintop and sacrificing him, that's morally wrong. And from the standpoint of human morality, when Krishna tells Arjuna to go onto the battlefield and kill his kinsmen in relations, that's morally wrong. We're not saying, we can't say, that it's become morally right just because God has said so. Instead, both of those individuals, through faith, have transcended beyond morality. And they have simply embraced that what God has said, there's a reason for. There's a purpose behind it. There's a reason why it has to be done. And that becomes the central message behind chapter 1, is simply to remind us that when we get these extraordinary stories of God says do this, it's not necessarily a case of, oh, we must do it because it's morally right. It may, by all intents and purposes, be morally wrong. But nonetheless, it's something that an individual who has absolute faith will do, simply because they believe that God's will should be obeyed. It's not about morality. It's not about right or wrong. Morality is a concern of the material world. It's a concern of our relationship with each other, and nothing more than that. So I will be back shortly with another video which talks about the specific examples. We'll talk about the Akedah as well as the story of the Bhagavad Gita shortly. So take care.